This is supposed to be one of the holiest sites in the world, in one of the holiest cities in the world. But this cell phone footage shot inside the Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem shows a scene that's anything but tranquil. Trapped inside, Palestinian worshippers are tear-gassed by Israeli forces. You can see the stained glass windows of the prayer hall being smashed by the police, who then aim their guns through the openings. Eventually, they enter the hall and begin arresting dozens of people. This scene has been repeated over and over. Israeli police raiding the compound, locking the mosque's doors, attacking with tear gas, rubber bullets, beatings, and arrests. In the ancient courtyard, people fight back with stones and fireworks. This is a city under occupation, where Israelis have the ultimate power, and they often succeed in clearing the compound to let these Jewish Israelis in. On the surface, this might seem like just a religious rivalry, but there's a lot more to this story. It's about control, not just of the holy sites, but of the land and the people who live on it. So we're gonna look at who these people are, what their goals are, and how a 1994 massacre of Palestinians at another holy site by an Israeli-American settler might shed light on where Jerusalem is headed today. Jerusalem is at the heart of three religions: Islam, Judaism, Christianity. But since occupying East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has aimed to ensure the city has a Jewish majority.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No.
To Palestinians who have been living under occupation and denied equality for decades, Al-Aqsa isn't just Islam's third holiest site, it's a symbol of their nationhood. Jews call Al-Aqsa the Temple Mount because it's believed to be the site where two ancient Jewish temples once stood. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans roughly 2,000 years ago, but until then it had been the center of Jewish worship, the holiest place for Jews. Still, even after they occupied the site in 1967, Israeli authorities maintained a policy that Jews should not pray there and that only Muslims can. But that might be changing. And these people are driving that. They belong to various groups that make up what's generally referred to as the Temple Mount movement. Their ultimate goal is to demolish the mosque, this symbol of Palestinian nationhood, this sacred site to Muslims worldwide, and build a third Jewish temple there. And they're pretty open about their plans.
For 34 years, the Temple Institute has been preparing for the rebuilding of the Holy Temple and the renewal of the divine service.
They've even got detailed architectural renderings of what the temple would look like. They receive financial support from the Israeli government and charities in the US, Canada, and the UK. In recent years, they've even offered cash rewards to Jews who enter the Al-Aqsa compound or slaughter animals there, which was part of Jewish ritual at the original temple. For decades, these activists were dismissed by most Israelis and constrained by the government. But that was then.
So a few years ago, this was considered fringe?
Zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream.
Yehuda Glick is one of the movement's most prominent figures, and he served in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. He's not the only one to reach that office.
10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who ascended Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 of the Knesset members.
It's become common for government ministers and leaders, and even the Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, to talk about imposing Jewish prayers at Al-Aqsa. Until the early 2000s, the number of Israeli Jews who entered the Al-Aqsa compound was very small, maybe a few dozen a year. But as the Temple Mount movement has moved into the mainstream, that number has recently grown to tens of thousands a year. With the Israeli government increasingly allowing the status quo at Al-Aqsa to change, the worry is that things are going in one direction, towards a situation where Palestinian access to it is restricted even more, the way it has been at another holy site in the wake of a bloody mass killing. Here's that story. 20 miles south of Jerusalem is the Israeli-occupied city of Hebron, where the prophet Abraham is believed to be buried with members of his family under this building. Abraham is a central figure for both Jews and Muslims. That's why Jews call this site the Cave of the Patriarchs, and Muslims refer to it as the Ibrahimi Mosque. After the occupation began in 1967, Hebron was the first place that Israelis settled in violation of international law. Jews and Muslims both prayed at the site, but the situation was volatile. On the morning of February 25, 1994, hundreds of Palestinian Muslims were praying at the Ibrahimi Mosque. An American-born Israeli settler, a reservist in the Israeli army carrying an automatic rifle, entered the mosque, waited for worshippers to kneel down in prayer, and then started shooting. Baruch Goldstein killed 29 people and injured more than 120. One witness described how there were bodies and blood everywhere. Goldstein's massacre ended when the survivors hit him with a fire extinguisher and beat him to death. The injured were rushed to hospitals, which were overwhelmed. And as news of the killing spread, protests broke out across Hebron. Israeli soldiers opened fire, killing more than 20 additional Palestinians in the following days. While we were researching this story, we came across a letter published in the New York Times in 1981. The author notes the difference between Palestinian and Israeli birth rates. The solution, he writes, is for Israel to, quote, act decisively to remove the Arab minority from within its borders. The letter was written by Baruch Goldstein 2 years before he left the United States for Israel. Goldstein joined the Israeli military and became an army doctor, but often refused to treat non-Jews. He joined an anti-Arab political party called Kach that was later banned for inciting racism. He lived and was eventually buried in Kiryat Arba, an illegal Israeli settlement in Hebron. The settlers there strongly believe that Hebron should be theirs alone.
I think that his act brought a lot of security to the Jewish people here in Hebron and Kiryat Arba.
After the massacre, the settlement's chief rabbi described Goldstein as holier than all the martyrs of the Holocaust. Goldstein's grave is often visited by supporters, and his tombstone reads, "He gave his life for the people of Israel, its Torah and land." The massacre led to big changes in Hebron at the expense of its victims, the Palestinians. Under the pretext of securing the settlers who lived in the Old City and preventing more violence, the Israeli army imposed a 2-week curfew on all of Hebron's Palestinians. It made the area around the Ibrahimi Mosque permanently off-limits to everyone except settlers and foreign tourists. This had been a bustling marketplace, a commercial center for Palestinian life. But after the massacre, these shopfronts were welded shut by the Israeli army. The Old City is now cut off from the rest of Hebron by dozens of Israeli checkpoints, making it very difficult for most Palestinians to get there or pray at the mosque. Israel also forcibly divided the Ibrahimi Mosque, 40% for Muslims and 60% for Jews, but all of it under full Israeli military control. Basically, the settlers won. And here's how that story is connected to today. Palestinians fear that what happened in Hebron in 1994 could be repeated in Jerusalem. It's not just about the possibility of another massacre, but the fact that the people who share Baruch Goldstein's beliefs have more power than ever in Israel. For example, the banned political party Goldstein was part of has rebranded. Some of its former members joined new parties and are now in the Israeli Knesset. They're drafting and passing laws and are part of the ruling coalition government. Take the Otzma Yehudit party, for instance. Its platform explicitly calls for Palestinians to leave, saying it'll work to remove the enemies of Israel from our country. It also calls for Israeli sovereignty and ownership to be imposed over the Temple Mount. And its leader had a photograph of Baruch Goldstein hanging on his living room wall.
זה החלום. זה החלום שהתגשם בעזרת השם.
הבעיה שיש שם, כרגע יש שם משהו אחר, אתה יודע, איתמר.
כרגע. הדגש הוא על הכרגע.
For Palestinians, that's a call to cut them off from Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, and another threat to their very presence on this land. Most of the world's governments, including Israel's biggest backer, the United States, have insisted for decades that a peace deal between Israelis and Palestinians would include a formula for dividing or sharing Jerusalem. But as the Israeli government moves steadily in the opposite direction, the US hasn't pushed back. Instead, it's done things that Israel believes strengthens its claims over the entire city, like moving the US embassy into Jerusalem. But if nothing is done to stop this trend, the consequences might be felt far beyond the Holy Land.